Hey, I'm making my own way, but I stumble and I falter every day. But I love my baby now. But I love my baby, I'm still learning how. Hey, 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 I'm okay. Stay with me.
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Pathways to Parenting show on the Teenage Brain. I am your host today, Leisha Conners Bauer, and I am the Director of Community Health at the University of Colorado. And joining me today is Dan Fox, and Dan is a local therapist who specializes in working with teens. Welcome, Dan.
Thanks. Hi.
So we're going to just jump right in and get started. And so, Dan, one of the things that I think is really important for parents to understand about the teen brain is just what a critical period of development this is for teenagers. I know we talk a lot about the toddler period of time and how that is so important in the development of your child. And I think we think that, the teens are going through so much with their emotional development, their social development, but also there's an important part that relates to their brain development. Could you talk a little bit more about that, Dan?
Sure. So for toddlers, in those first couple of years of life, that is the most critical time. The brain is growing at rates that we never see again. However, adolescence is the second most. And during adolescence, unlike when our kids are infants, there isn't the same amount of support and nurturing that we can do for our kids as we were when they were toddlers. So we're in this kind of double bind situation where on the one hand, the brain is growing very rapidly and in ways that our kids don't really understand how to manage or understand what's happening to them. And at the same time, we are in a more compromised position as parents to figure out how can we be supportive of them during these critical stages. And the three things that I want to just touch on first in terms of what the teenage brain is doing is overproduction, myelination, and pruning. So this has to do with the neurons that are in the brain. We're developing many, many neurons during adolescence. They're growing at an incredibly rapid rate, hundreds of thousands as we're talking right now. And for our teens, this is at an even higher rate. It's unlike any other time except infancy. So that's what we call overproduction. Our brain is developing so many neurons that they can't stay in their brain forever. So we're going to be producing a lot, but then at the same time pruning ones that aren't getting used. And the pruning process is quite severe in that it's not very moral-based or value-based. It's not necessarily what we would want to have pruned from our kids. It's more that the areas of the brain that aren't getting much use tend to have more of the neurons pruned off. So if we think about social experiences being critically important during this time frame, because this is a time where abstract thinking is coming into play, kids are more able to imagine themselves in relation to other people and imagine what people are thinking and feeling about them. That kind of abstract thinking can create kids who text, 5,000 times a month, or I guess now it's Snapchat or Instagram 5,000 times a month. And if you gave a phone to a 7-year-old, they just wouldn't be able to come up with the content, the abstract thinking to be able to put in that many texts. But here we are at this age, and that's happening quite a bit. So if we take a child who is going through adolescence and they don't have a lot of social practice and social environmental stimulation, we are going to lose from their brain through the pruning process a lot of the gray matter, a lot of the non-myelinated neurons during that process. And it's going to be harder for them later on to actually grow the ability to be healthy and social and to think in social ways because they didn't get that during adolescence. So we've got overproduction, we've got pruning, and myelination is that process where we take two neurons that are firing in concert and our brain literally puts like a fatty sheath around the connection and it makes it go lightning fast so that now we have, instead of just one neuron firing to the next, it just kind of goes down really quickly down the neural chain. And because of that myelination, it is much more likely to happen, and it happens more quickly that those neurons fire together. That's a really important process for learning, both learning about social things, learning about the self, but also learning academic things. if you and I were to go to Italy with a bunch of high school students, and we went for a week, and you and I used our good, study skills and practice to figure out how to study Italian and what we wanted to learn, and they just kind of goofed around and hung out with a few Italian kids that they met while they were there. In a month after we'd gotten back, guess who knows more about how to speak Italian?
Okay, I find that just slightly depressing because I'm going to Peru later this summer with a group of teenagers.
Good luck.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's interesting what you talk about that pruning process. It sort of sounds like a use it or lose it kind of process. And so one of the things that I read, it's like if your teen is spending too much time on video games, they're overdeveloping that part of their brain. Or I even saw something about when the Twilight novels were really, really popular about how that just reading all of those books has an influence on the brain. How do we as parents really make sure that there's some balance there?
Right. Boy, that's a great question, and I'm glad that you brought up screen time, video games, because what we see from the research is that our frontal lobes, which are responsible for focus, executive functioning, these kinds of critical things during adolescence that we want to see developed, that's not happening when they're playing video games. In fact, there's a study that came out where we put kids and adults in front of screens for about 15 minutes and then had them do like a boring, repetitive puzzle. And the people that had been in front of this screen for 15 minutes perform worse on the boring puzzle than people who had not spent that 15 minutes prior on a screen. So we're literally teaching people to become more ADHD-like in their brain. We're deactivating these important parts of the frontal lobes, which are just coming online in a big way, in an adult-like way during adolescence, and instead we're replacing it with this sort of repetitive, not super sensorial in its stimulation, right? There's not a lot of modalities that we're working with when we're doing this. The games are designed to just kind of keep us in the game mode, continue to play, continue to look for the next big win. And though that's good for the game developers, they're there to make money. And they make money because they addict kids to these games, and then kids want to spend money on in-game purchases so that their virtual self can suddenly look awesome in the virtual world.
So I wonder, the screen time study that you're talking about, what I'm seeing with my high school student is he's doing more and more assignments online, research online, even group projects are online through Google Docs or different formats like that. So he spends a lot of time in front of a screen, and a lot of it's for academic, a part of it is for academic purposes. So I'm wondering if that also has that same impact, or is it because it's a different function?
Boy, that's a great question. The American Academy of Pediatrics, they take a distinction between what they call entertainment media and then the other things that we're doing for school or typing a paper or watching some video related to school or being on a chat room that's academic in nature. Those kinds of things they separate out. So the American Academy of Pediatrics says that for the total amount of entertainment media, right, the amount of time that we want our kids to be on that, ideally is less than 2 hours. If they're under the age of 2, they say that there is no benefit. They don't say don't do it because they don't want to get themselves into that hot water, but they say there's no benefit to the developing brain to watch videos if you're under the age of 2. So if you've got lots of little Einstein videos going on, that's fantastic if you need an electronic babysitter for half an hour, but if you're trying to convince yourself that that's actually helping your child's brain to grow, that's not true.
Interesting. Something to pay attention to, I think.
Absolutely. And what we find is that kids are actually spending 8, 9, 10 hours on average a day in front of screens. So my hunch is that more than 2 hours of that time is on entertainment media.
Yeah, I would imagine so. You said this earlier when you were talking about Snapchat and Instagram, and that if you gave a 7-year-old a phone, they wouldn't be able to come up with the content for that. But a teen will. So it seems like one of the things that's happening is sort of that shift in decision-making skills related to the abstract thinking, becoming less concrete. Because I sort of seem to remember that kids in that 6, 7, 8, they're pretty concrete. They tend to view things in black and white, but not so much when you're a teenager.
Absolutely. A lot of times at that younger age, they're thinking in terms of what does a good boy or a good girl do, and how can I do those things? Or what does my parent expect from me, and how can I do those things? By the time they're teenagers, now it becomes much more of a difficult decision because there's so many factors that are coming into play in this budding adult-like brain. And they have to sort through all of these new ways of thinking and understanding their world. So whatever executive functioning strategies they may have had to manage their world in pre-adolescence, well, now they have an adult-like brain. They have adult-like emotions and adult-like thoughts. It's not regulated like an adult. It's a new adult brain. This is like having an infant who has the capacity to move their arms and legs, but it will take years before they can walk right and not spill their sippy cup. But for a teenager, they've got all of that stuff in place, ready to go. It's just that it isn't well practiced. And we know that it takes until the mid-20s before we see the gray matter, which is those kind of non-myelinated neurons in the frontal lobe, turning white to indicate that, yes, now we have this nice synchronized system that is making good adult-like decisions.
And I think that that's a really good point when you talk about that development of the executive function and the prefrontal cortex. And, one of the things that we tend to associate with adolescence is risk-taking. And I think that there's a part of that relates to the brain because we're relying more on the limbic system, which is the emotional center of the brain, and that a teen may know after the fact, yeah, I shouldn't have done that, but in the moment, maybe with the executive functioning not as fully developed, it's harder to make that decision in the moment.
Absolutely. And I'd like to get into why that happens. So we have the hindbrain, the reptilian brain, or what I like to call the lizard brain. I didn't make this up, but I like the term because we can contrast the lizard brain with the wizard brain, which is more of that prefrontal cortex area. So the lizard brain is responsible for, above all else, physical survival of a threat. And when we see something that is unfamiliar or something that reminds us in our memory of something bad, the lizard brain will just pull the alarm and it'll go into fight or flight mode. Adrenaline will surge through our body and we're rushing the blood, which normally likes to go to our brain. We rush that to our arms and legs to fight or flee from the situation. That was great a long time ago when there were real threats out there quite a bit. But you and I and most people in the adult world, or really in this day and age, we tend to not have a lot of true physical threats to our survival. And in fact, the reptilian brain is already wired to survive those situations very well. So, for example, if you put your hand on a hot stove, it'll come off right away before we even really think about it. We're not going, that feels hot. Should I move my hand? Who turned that stove on? Right? We don't do that. It happens first, and then our wizard brain goes, oh, whoa, wow, that was a hot stove. I'm glad I got my hand away. So now that our kids are coming into adolescence, that wizard brain is coming online more, and there's many more ways that they can think and feel about the world. And by necessity, by design, that creates more content for them to have emotional stress or to feel the sense of an emotional threat. The wizard brain and the lizard brain are terrible communicators. When the wizard brain experiences an emotional threat, all the lizard brain understands is threat that I must survive. In fact, Daniel Goleman, who wrote Emotional Intelligence, calls this the amygdala hijack, which is, the amygdala is that part that sounds the alarm for the fight or flight mode. And so we have these emotional experiences that feel terrible, and somehow the lizard brain goes, I got to survive this physically, and it drains the blood from our brain to our arms and legs. Our brain normally has about a third of the blood and oxygen that we generate to make it function normally, but during these times of survival mode, during the sympathetic response for our nervous system, we end up depleting that considerably. We don't even really think straight, right? When we have those moments, we all experience that as adults, where we, whether it's like somebody cut us off or we had a frustrating interaction with another person. These aren't physical threats, but we have a physical reaction in our body. That physical reaction is our sympathetic nervous system gearing up to try to address the situation. So by design, our brain is going to have this problem as we go into adolescence and adulthood. And in part, it's by the nature of our current culture and our world around us. Right? There's so much overstimulation going on that eventually one of these things that's stimulating is going to either feel unfamiliar or be a reminder of something bad. And boom, the lizard brain just goes right into fight or flight mode. So here's the problem. Emotional threats, emotional challenges, the stress of our daily life needs to be met with strong executive functioning interventions. And that means our wizard brain has to stay online, which it doesn't tend to do when we're in this fight or flight mode. So we know that we're definitely going to have this problem arise as kids get into adolescence. What is not a given, but what is quite important, is to help our kids learn strategies to have a relaxation response. Rather than going into their sympathetic nervous system, we want them to be able to somehow stay in that parasympathetic response. When we're in the parasympathetic response, our body is doing a lot of nice long-term functions like digesting food or healing illness or injury. It's regulating sleep. And we certainly see a lot of people in the adult world who have anxiety or stress in such a way that it's manifesting with our ability to sleep, our ability to eat and digest food well. We're getting sick all the time. Our injuries aren't healing that quickly. Right? All that stuff is the product of an overactivated lizard response. So we have to actually train this. We have to practice this in our brain so that these unfamiliar feelings become more familiar, and we start to develop the sense of there's no physical threat here. There is no physical fear. I need to breathe. I need to relax. I need to listen to music. I need to get some exercise. Whatever it is that is our sort of go-to strategies, we want to enhance them and practice them so that we really develop a strong foundation to be able to have an emotional threat lead to a relaxed response that allows our executive functioning to flourish and resolve the situation.
So it also seems like, and one of the things that you're saying, that we as adults will still have that activated lizard brain. So if we have a teenager who's in a high emotional state, it will activate for us as well. So how do we resist that impulse to meet high emotion with high emotion, and work with our kids in starting to develop those skills?
Boy, that's a really good question. I have 4 children, and I don't know, they just knock me to my knees all the time with this kind of thing. But seriously, the trick is that for us as adults, if you're with a kid that you have either raised or you see in school a lot, like somebody you have a real connection with, what we notice is that neurologically we have mirror neurons. So if a child is very distressed, a teenager is very distressed, if their fight or flight system is activated, well, by golly, that person who's close to them is getting activated too in the same parts of the brain. So we have to work doubly hard because now it's not just regulating our own internal world, but we're getting heavily influenced by the chaos of this young adult brain next to us. However, the converse is also true. If we are able to maintain a sense of calm, their calm neurons are mirroring us back. So we hold the space, we allow our energy to kind of stay in our mind and in our body so that we're able to go, okay, there is no physical threat here. It stinks that this person is yelling. It stinks that they might be calling me names. But I don't need to actually go into this sort of, oh, I can't believe you're doing this kind of mode, because that we know is just going to escalate to some sort of blowout that we'll then have to sort of repair and get past, which is when you asked that question earlier about after these emotional outbursts, later on, we're like, oh, I can't believe that happened. That's just not like me. Well, it is like us. It's like us all when we're in that fight or flight mode. And then 20 minutes later, when we're back and we're through it, we look back at it and we go, oh my gosh, I can't even believe I was acting that way. But we can speed that up. As adults, we can catch it more quickly, and we can see it in our kids, and we can help them to recognize it in themselves.
So we had a couple questions that came in online related to, well, what happens in circumstances where you have teenagers who may already have neurological differences, like they may be diagnosed with dyslexia or ADHD, or they may be autistic and high functioning, or autistic and not high functioning. What happens in the brain development in instances like that?
Boy, those are really good and complicated questions. I'm going to take a few broad strokes at them. I want to distinguish ADHD from dyslexia and autism spectrum disorders, because for ADHD, oftentimes we see on a brain scan that those frontal lobes are very underactivated. However, for many, many people, by the time they're reaching 12, 13, 14 years old, that starts to shift. So we see during adolescence this ability for their brain to actually start to overcome some of the impulse problems that they had or some of the focus problems that they had in earlier childhood. Of course, that's not true for everyone, right? There are many people that have adult ADHD or adult ADD, and in those situations, we want to really help them with skills of being able to focus, with skills of being able to activate their frontal lobes, and with all the kind of supports, whether it's sleep, exercise, diet, medication, the things that help us to be able to really stay balanced on the inside so our brain can work as designed. Now, if we take someone with an autism spectrum disorder, we know that there's atypical brain wiring. Now, a lot of people have atypical brain wiring. I'm left-handed. We know left-handed people have atypical brain wiring. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's a problem. It just means that our brain is sending blood and oxygen to other places that aren't typically getting as much as the sort of normal brain wandering around the world, if we could call it normal. But if we have a database of normalized brains, autism spectrum disordered kiddos tend to be on one or the other end of the spectrum. So that tends to persist through adolescence. It doesn't kind of fix itself the way ADHD might. And we know that the earlier we can identify and address that, the more likely we are to help the child to develop skills and strategies so that the atypical wiring starts to wire and fire in a way that is more functional for them. We also know that, there was this great study out about kids with autism spectrum disorders and how they perceive a hug. So if you and I were to hug somebody, we would experience it as a felt sense of a hug, right? Our brain would see ourselves hugging and get the sort of emotional and social benefit from that. There's a part in our brain that would light up that's like, oh, I'm being hugged. Doesn't that feel nice? Now, a kiddo with autism spectrum disorder tends to not have that part of the brain light up. So they're more seeing the hug experience as if they were an outsider just sort of witnessing two people hug. And we get that felt sense from kids with autism spectrum disorder. Their ability to kind of express physically warmth and connection, right? The hug is just sort of a different kind of thing. And it's that they're not actually experiencing it on the same emotional level the way we are. So we want to be able to understand specifically for kids with autism spectrum disorder, what are the ways that they are really struggling? Because there's a whole spectrum, right? We can't say, all right, these are the three things that are always going to be in place for somebody in that situation. But if we can really take the time at a younger age to understand where their challenges are and to have direct interventions with a lot of practice and support, we can make great gains. And boy, those kiddos, they have incredible, incredible minds and are able to do amazing things with them if we can get them to have a little more functionality in some of the things that are required for like success in school. Then they can get to the place where by the time they're adults, they can be highly functional and able to participate in society.
Thanks. That is a very complicated topic, and I think a very challenging one. So we are actually running short on time, which is amazing. I find the whole topic of the teenage brain fascinating, probably because I'm living with a teenage brain right now.
Yours or your child's?
It could be both. But before we go, Dan, I just wanted to give you the opportunity, because as parents, we want to know what are the things that we can best do to support our kids. And it seems like that you've touched on some of those things in your talk, and the part about trying really to stay calm and mirror so that our kids can mirror that and not meet high emotion with high emotion, so we can start teaching them some of the skills that we need, that they need. But I think it would also be helpful if there's some other things that you would like for parents to know as we're dealing or living with our kiddos who are going through this intense period of brain development.
Boy, that's a great question. And there's one thing that I think is a sort of generalized form that we want to look at each time we're working with our kiddos through some sort of challenging neurological experience. So if we go back to that idea that the wizard brain takes an emotional threat, and somehow by the time that information reaches the lizard brain, it's just a threat, and we sound the alarm instead of relaxing and having our executive functioning skills come and save the day for us, right? What we want to do to help our kids grow the capacity to do that is to have whatever it was that was the stimulus, whether it's external through the sensory perceptions or whether it's internal through memories or thoughts or cognitions. We want to be able to have that stimulus fire at the same time we're relaxed, which is hard to do for a teenager because they're pretty overwhelmed and their brain is kind of going all over the place very quickly. It takes a while to really learn how to regulate. So it's not like if you do this one time or 50 times, you will necessarily see a noticeable difference. But luckily, the brain is growing from their early adolescence to mid-20s in a way that is, quite profound in terms of the amount of growth and change. We know it grows throughout the entire life. We're growing neural connections throughout our entire lifetime. But in these years, we have this critical period where if we can develop the practice of a two-step approach, first, helping them to chill out, right? Helping them to get back to that parasympathetic nervous system, helping them into that relaxation response first. And then second, from that place, to review, to reflect, to plan a new strategy for whatever it was that was causing the dilemma in the first place, that is going to grow a healthier brain. And if we do that enough, all of a sudden they're in their mid-20s and things are kind of firing in the right way. And it looks like they're going to be able to make it out there in the world.
I mean, it seems like an important piece of that is when something's happening in the moment is not the time to talk about what could you have done differently, but to wait until till you're in that calming place and there's a hope that there'll be a little more rational response to those kind of things.
Right. And in fact, many times when I see parents in my office with their kiddos, in the moment, we just get triggered as parents. And so we end up doing the opposite of pacifying the situation. We see that their brain is off track and that they're talking about things that just don't even make sense, or they're making up stories that happened yesterday. We're like, well, you said this and you said that. And it's like, actually, that's not true. I didn't say that. Now, that might be an accurate statement from the parent, but that doesn't pacify. That doesn't help them to settle down enough so that they can really activate their frontal lobes. It just keeps them in this fight or flight state. And sure enough, the parent gets there too pretty darn soon. So if we are going to, in the moment, try to do anything, we want to validate their internal experience. We want to go, wow, that's really hard. That sounds really tough. Which, of course, we all know validation. It's easy. It's almost so easy. It's like, validation. Like, let's not even bother talking about that. It's like so simple, like tying our shoes. But I'm telling you, when our kid is triggered and they're coming at us, we're terrible validators. We do it like less than 5% of the time.
And it might be we do it more frequently with people that we interact with on a regular basis, like friends or colleagues, as opposed to the people that we have a close relationship with.
Let's hope our friends and colleagues aren't triggering us the same way our teens are.
Okay, there's that. All right, we are actually out of time today, and I'd like to thank Dan for being here and our audience and the sponsors who are really critical for making this happen, particularly the Boulder Valley School District and Boulder Psychological Services. Thank you for tuning in today, and we hope to see you again soon.
And now the planet's done its bowing down. Soon the growth returns to follow ground. But I know what's churning underneath the snow. And I love my baby and we've miles to go. Hey, 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 I'm okay. Be with me. We'll beat this, can't you see? So wait a while, winter time.